Howdy readers, I'm Jason, this is Chapter and Verse, and tonight I want to talk with you guys a little bit about the Neo-Victorian novel in honor of Victober, the month-long read-along in October, where everybody reads, well, everybody who participates just reads their way through as much Victorian literature as they can. I'm not participating this year, but I wholeheartedly plan to participate next year. But I wanted to kind of put on your radar, if it's not already on your radar, the phenomenon of the Neo-Victorian novel. And so what is that, you might ask? Well, Peg, the book prize addict, about 11 months ago, put up a video as kind of an introduction to the Neo-Victorian novel. It's just a good kind of general overview, and she gives a few examples. So essentially what it is it's a contemporary literary novel that is set in Victorian England, or in the world of kind of the Victorian British Empire, and deals with issues or concerns that were either really vital to the Victorian age or were really contentious among the Victorian populace. So a few examples of the Neo-Victorian novel. So the most famous example, and it's the first one that Peg talks about as well in her video, is A.S. Byatt's Possession. This is our Folio Society edition of this. And this is a novel about two contemporary poetry scholars who stumble onto a connection between two Victorian poets, a man and a woman, who had, up to that point, never really been connected in the scholarship before. Nobody had ever been aware that these two Victorian poets had known each other, let alone maybe been in love with each other. And Byatt does a great thing in this book in that she inhabits the voice and the art of the two fictional Victorian poets, Randolph Henry Ashe and Christabel Lamotte. And I studied this book in graduate school. I had read it prior to that as well, but I studied it in grad school, and I still remember my professor, John Glendening, whose books are going to make an appearance in this video later, talking about how A.S. Byatt was a pretty darn good Victorian poet herself. So one of the things that's really wonderful about this book, and that doesn't get talked about a lot, is how the novel engages with the fascination with spiritualism in the Victorian age. It was a big deal, spiritualism, seances, mediums, this idea that people could somehow speak to the ghosts of their loved ones. And that figures pretty largely in this book. Another Neo-Victorian novel in which that's true is Affinity by Sarah Waters. Sarah Waters is best known for her first novel, Tipping the Velvet, and for her novel Fingersmith, and she's been discussed quite a lot here on BookTube the last few weeks for The Little Stranger. I know Juan from Just One Reader recently read it, and maybe people are reading The Little Stranger right now because of Halloween, but this is every bit as spooky a book as The Little Stranger. And this is set in Victorian England, primarily in a women's prison. And it deals as well with the world of seances and repercussions that are the fallout, essentially, from a death that occurs during a seance. Spiritualism is up front and center in this novel. And the next book I'm going to show you is not a novel, it's a work of nonfiction about that late Victorian fascination with spiritualism. This is maybe my favorite nonfiction book. I have read it multiple times, I have taught it. I maintain that it has the most gripping opening few pages of maybe anything I've ever read. And that is Ghost Hunters by Deborah Blum. And it is about William James and a kind of crew of academics that he put together to investigate the mediums of the day. They had decided that if these people were frauds, that they couldn't be proven frauds unless what they were claiming, what they were doing with seances and such, were put through rigorous experiments. And The rest of the scientific community wanted no part of it. They thought William James and his team of researchers were wasting their lives and ruining their careers by giving these people the time of day. But I find the book utterly fascinating. Another Neo-Victorian novel is one of my favorite novels of all time, and that is Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey. This won the Booker Prize in the late 80s, and this novel deals with another just powerful hang-up of the Victorian age, and that is religion. Specifically, and it's less so in this book than it might have been, but specifically with the tension between religion and kind of scientific progress. So in this novel, Oscar Hopkins, as a boy, is raised by a father who is a pastor with the Plymouth Brethren. And their relationship was based on the true life relationship featured in this memoir. And this is Father and Son by Edmund Gosse. And Edmund Gosse's father was a minister in Victorian England named Philip Gosse. And he wrote a very famous book from the time called Omphalos. And Omphalos was in direct conversation with Charles Lyell's work on the geological record. And anyway, there are passages in Father and Son that they weren't lifted by Peter Carey in his novel, but the echoes are so strong that you get the feeling that at times, writing Oscar and Lucinda, Peter Carey had this book open on the desk next to him. So another work of nonfiction from the Victorian era, or just prior to the Victorian era, actually, that dealt with this kind of tension between religion and the scientific progress that was kind of occurring in the early to mid 19th century, was Natural Theology by William Paley. This was a book that was really influential on Darwin's work with The Origin of Species. I mean, it was his book was kind of a rebuttal to this in some ways, but he was influenced by the structure of this book, by the vision of this book, even if he didn't agree with it. And so now I want to show you a couple of books that were written by my thesis advisor. And the first one is The Evolutionary Imagination in Late-Victorian Novels, an Entangled Bank. It's by John Glendening. And Glendening, he's a Victorianist, and he also really loves Neo-Victorian fiction. So for any of you who are interested in the intersections between evolutionary theory and the Victorian age, specifically Victorian fiction, look for this book. I think it's still in print. It's expensive as hell, so try to track it down, maybe on interlibrary loan. But another book by Glendening is called Science and Religion in Neo-Victorian Novels, Eye of the Ichthyosaur. And that's this one right here. And it is specifically about what I'm talking about with regard to Neo-Victorian novels and the ways in which they engage with the issues of the Victorian age. There is a chapter in this book called Paradises Lost, The Voyage of the Narwhal and English Passengers. And those are the next two books that I want to talk about. So here's The Voyage of the Narwhal. This was published, if memory serves, around 1998, I think. Andrea Barrett is a genius writer. She actually won a MacArthur Genius Grant once upon a time. But this isn't strictly a Victorian novel in that, if memory serves, very little of it takes place in England. More of it takes place, I think, on the east coast of America. And the bulk of it really takes place on a ship. But this is a novel that dealt with the Victorian fascination with exploration and with mapping the world as we know it and finding the furthest edge of our known world. It's a beautiful book. I've only read it once, and that was, oh my God, that was 16 years ago, 18 years ago. And I still remember certain scenes in this incredibly well. And then the last book I wanted to talk about, which again, Glendening wrote about in conversation with Voyage of the Narwhal, is English Passengers by Matthew Kneale. And this was a finalist for the Booker Prize. I have not read this, But let me just read a couple of sentences from the back for you. In 1857, when Captain Iliam Quillian Cooley and his band of rum smugglers from the Isle of Man have most of their illicit goods confiscated by British customs, they are forced to put their ship Sincerity up for charter. The only takers are two eccentric Englishmen headed for the island of Tasmania, the Reverend Geoffrey Wilson, who believes the Garden of Eden was located there, and Dr. Thomas Porter, who is developing a sinister thesis about the races of men. So again, I don't know too much about this book. From what I understand, there's a certain kind of strain of comedy in it as well, which sounds like a lot of fun. Actually sounds maybe a little bit like T.C. Boyle's novel Water Music, which is almost a kind of Neo-Victorian novel. It is set in the late 18th century and early 19th century, but it's also about exploration. And it's a brilliant book. I love Water Music. So I thought it might be fun for those of you who are taking part in Victober to have a sense of some of the titles written in the here and now that are dealing with that same world that we love so much in Victorian literature. I'm a huge fan of Victorian literature, but that are examining the issues of that age through a kind of modern lens and a modern sensibility. Neo-Victorian fiction is it's a pretty cool thing. I will put the titles of some more examples of it in the description box below, as well as the links to Peg's video on Neo-Victorian fiction and the announcement videos for this Victober from Katie at Books and Things and the other booktubers who are hosting. I'll leave it there, and I will see you guys again very soon. Adios.